Have you ever experienced a mental health issue of any kind? And if you have, well, that's not unusual. According to our guest, Dr. Victor Vogel, every year 1 in 5 of us has some sort of mental health symptoms because, as he said, that's what life does. This is especially true when we go through life events such as the death of a family member or friend, a divorce, job loss, financial stress, and so on. But how does that affect your chances of getting or keeping a pilot medical certificate? Stick around and he'll tell you what you need to know. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 334, we talked with CFI John Fiskus about tips for CFIs and pilots for flying safely in the traffic pattern. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/334. And if you're new to the show, welcome. If you would take a moment right now and on the app that you're listening to, touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, which is up at the top of the screen, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. But first, let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show supported by people just like you. So if you've been listening for a while and you feel that you're getting value from the show, if you would, please go check out our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and the Patreon app. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. You can also support the show whenever you buy a Lightspeed headset if you first go to aviationnewstalk.com/lightspeed to get to their website. Thanks for your support. Coming up on the news for the week of June 10th, 2024, Cirrus Aircraft says that G100UL fuel may void warranties. 2 people were killed in a twin Cessna crash in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and a student pilot helps to save a moose. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org, in a service advisory published June 19th, Cirrus Aircraft wrote that they may nullify warranties for aircraft that use unleaded General Aviation Modification Inc. G100UL fuel. The announcement is a setback for GAMI, which has spent years developing an unleaded, high-octane fuel to replace leaded gas in the worldwide fleet of piston airplanes. Cirrus has tested G100UL in its SR-20, SR-22, and SR-22T aircraft, and the company said it finds some aspects of the new fuel encouraging, but critical safety questions regarding materials compatibility remain inconclusive. Quote, Cirrus does not approve the use of GAMI G100UL fuel in SR series airplanes, the company said in its advisory. Cirrus does not warrant or represent in any way an operator's use of GAMI G100UL in SR series airplanes. G100UL is made from a different chemical composition than leaded avgas. Any avgas replacement must be compatible with existing aircraft fuel tanks, bladders, lines, and accessories, in addition to performing well in engines. About 2,500 Cirrus aircraft are covered by standard 3-year and extended 5-year warranties. According to the terms of these warranties, they become void if, quote, products not supported or approved by Cirrus are installed on or applied to the aircraft. From WRAL.com, 2 killed as twin-engine Cessna crashes in Colorado mobile home park. 2 people were killed when a twin-engine Cessna crashed in a residential area in north-central Colorado on Monday, starting a fire that burned 2 mobile homes. The pilot and a passenger died when the Cessna 421 went down near the Steamboat Springs Airport just before 4:30 p.m. Police said all residents of the mobile home park were accounted for. The fire also burned several outbuildings. The plane was believed to have taken off from Longmont, Colorado, and was on its way to Ogden, Utah. Witnesses reported the airplane appeared to have mechanical issues. And later during my updates, I'll talk more about this crash and also about another fatal twin crash, both of which happened in the past week. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a hazardous attitude of invulnerability. This comes from a NASA ASRS report written by the pilot. He writes, I was flying with my student pilot. We completed the pre-flight on the Diamond DA-40 and everything looked good. I let my student taxi us to the run-up area on the ramp. This was his second time doing it. The run-up area was getting closer, and I told my student to add 18 inches of manifold pressure and step hard on the right brake to turn us to a west heading. However, my student added too much power and did not step on the right brake hard enough. The turn was aggressive and abrupt. It happened so fast and a big thud sound happened. At that point, I took flight controls and stopped the aircraft. My first thought was that we damaged the nose wheel or popped the tire. I also thought we might have hit the yellow poles that are located on the edge of the pavement. My thought process was, first, check the nose wheel. So I added power and advanced forward to see if it seemed stable, and it was. Then I kept replaying the event in my head to see if we could have been too close to hit the left wingtip on the yellow poles. My student asked if he should go look at it. However, I told myself there was no way we hit the wingtip because I gave my student enough distance. My thought process was, I've been to the run-up area before, and I know the distance to turn. This turned into the hazardous attitude of invulnerability. I talked myself out of believing that we could have hit our wingtip. I thought it was the nose wheel, and since I checked it and it was good, I proceeded with the flight. I decided not to shut down the engine and look at the wingtip. Now you can see where this story is headed. It continues, after our flight, my student was putting on the tie-down for the left wing when he told me that there was damage, and we did hit the yellow poles during our setup for ground check at the run-up. Looking back at this event, it could have been prevented by shutting down the engine and checking the wingtip before we flew. That would have been the safest choice. Learning from this event, I know going forward that when you talk yourself out of a reality and take away the thought of, I have done this before and the distance to turn was enough, that is not an answer, and checking the aircraft and shutting down the engine is the best action. Also from generalaviationnews.com, overweight post-maintenance flight ends in injuries. Now this comes from a final NTSB report. It says, the pilot was conducting a third maintenance test flight at the airport in Crescent, Texas, after a new engine had been installed in the Cessna P210N. The airplane's co-owner and 2 other passengers were on board. The airplane was full of fuel and no pre-flight weight and balance calculations were completed. During the takeoff roll, the pilot rotated about 51 knots, which was 20 knots below normal rotation speed, and the airplane became airborne briefly before it settled back on the runway. He then added nose-up trim, rotated at 55 knots, and climbed slowly. He continued to climb the airplane when the co-owner heard the stall warning horn. The pilot made a left turn to avoid terrain at the south end of the runway and then set up for a forced landing as the airplane was unable to maintain altitude. During the forced landing, the airplane hit trees and terrain. It sustained substantial damage to the fuselage and both wings. The pilot was seriously injured, while the 3 passengers sustained minor injuries. A post-accident weight and balance calculation determined that the airplane was about 359 pounds over the maximum takeoff weight. Probable cause, the pilot's failure to complete proper pre-flight performance planning and his operation of the airplane outside of the manufacturer's specified weight and balance limitations. From fearoflanding.com, Cessna 172M forced landing after go-around in New South Wales. On the 15th of October 2023, a private pilot rented a Cessna 172M from Air Gold Coast for a private flight from Gold Coast Airport, Queensland, to Murwillumbah in New South Wales. The pilot had a total of 107 flight hours, however it was 121 days since his last flight. The pilot joined the traffic pattern at Murwillumbah, joining downwind for runway 1. The pilot felt that the approach was stable, but that the aircraft was too high on the approach, about 300 to 350 feet above the ground, as the aircraft crossed the threshold and decided to conduct a go-around. The pilot configured the aircraft for the go-around and applied full throttle. The engine made a loud bang. It didn't seem to be responding with enough power for the go-around. The fuel mixture was rich, the master switch was on, the magnetos were set to both, and the carburetor heat was off. With so much going on, the pilot did not recall checking the engine RPM, but it seemed clear that the Cessna did not have enough power to climb. As it passed the midpoint of the runway, the nose dipped down, and then a moment later the aircraft pitched up. There was a loud bang or pop sound, which the witness thought sounded like the throttle was pushed forward too quickly. There was not enough runway left to attempt to land. The speed dropped, and the Cessna began to buffet in warning of an impending stall. The pilot lowered the nose and saw a cane field ahead. During the hard landing, the right wing was crushed, and the pilot had just a minor injury from the shoulder strap. Notably, police photographs showed a nose wheel steering tow bar, which was lying loose on the front passenger's seat rather than stowed under the seat or in a net in the baggage compartment. And by the way, it probably came flying forward from the rear. It continues, the pilot was lucky that the tow bar didn't do any damage. Now, the issue was that the pilot didn't raise the flaps from the 40-degree position in the go-around. The article says the pilot told investigators that the risk of stalling was a worry, so it seems safer to keep the flaps at 40 degrees to maintain as much lift as possible and reduce the stall speed. Now, the fallacy here is that at 40 degrees you have far more drag than you have lift. In fact, you probably have hardly any lift at 40 degrees. Continuing on, thus the pilot was aware that the flaps were still at 40 degrees, but did not associate full flaps with a lack of power and slow climb. The ATSB concluded in the final report that as the Cessna managed to climb about 200 feet with the flaps set to full, there was not any issue with engines providing power. And the final report says contributing factors: during the go-around, it's likely the aircraft was incorrectly configured, resulting in reduced climb performance. And let me just add, there have been many accidents in older Cessna 172s that have 40 degrees of flaps when the pilot forgets to follow the procedure and raise the flaps to 20 degrees for a go-around. And those accidents are most likely the reason that Cessna later changed the 172 so that the flaps would only go to a maximum of 30 degrees. Because if you were to forget to raise the flaps during a go-around, you'd probably still have some climb capability. But with 40 degrees of flaps, you're unlikely to be able to climb out during a go-around. Also from GeneralAviationNews.com, this comes from a NASA ASRS report called What's a Phenom? The pilot wrote, "I followed the wrong landing traffic. I was number 2 cleared to land behind an Embraer Phenom 100. I did not know what a Phenom was and turned final to land number 2 behind a single-engine aircraft that was touching down. I was high on final as I was doing a practice localizer approach circle to land at 660-foot minimums. The Phenom passed about 200 to 300 feet below me as the traffic I was supposed to follow. I think this could be avoided by clarifying what kind of aircraft it is, such as jet or Cessna. In the future, I, as well as other pilots, should ask for clarification if they do not know what for sure their clearance limit is, or if they are unsure, especially on a busy day." And in other news, from globalair.net, Archer Aviation and Signature announced the signing of an MOU focusing on the electrification of Signature's network of more than 200 airport terminals, providing Archer with access to takeoff and landing sites across the U.S. and globally. The MOU is a step toward one day launching Archer's air taxi service in major United Airline hubs like Newark International and Chicago O'Hare. And from AOPA.org, Mike Ginter, a retired U.S. Navy pilot, has been appointed to a new post leading the AOPA Air Safety Institute. Ginter spent 27 years in the U.S. Navy, retiring with the rank of captain. During that time, he accrued more than 5,300 flight hours and 555 carrier landings, completed 4 deployments to the Persian Gulf, commanded a jet squadron, and served as operations officer for the USS John F. Kennedy. From globalair.com, Boom Supersonic celebrated the completion of its Overture Superfactory in Greensboro, North Carolina on Monday. The facility is the first supersonic airliner factory in the U.S., and the company held a ribbon-cutting ceremony to celebrate the milestone. And from AOPA.org, Icon Aircraft announced that SG Investments has purchased the company. Icon filed for bankruptcy in April. The most recently revised liquidation analysis in the case indicates unsecured creditors will be repaid less than a penny on the dollar once the $15.79 million sale is complete. And finally, from CBC.ca, Alaska man helps trapped and shrieking baby moose while avoiding its mama. When Spencer Warren pulled up to work on Friday, he heard a strange, high-pitched creaking sound from the nearby lake. Quote, "I'm used to the animals on the lake," and I said, "That's an odd-sounding bird," said Warren, a pilot in training at Destination Alaska Adventure Company, a charter tourism company near Beluga Lake in Homer, Alaska. But to my surprise, it wasn't. When he followed the shrieks, he found a frightened baby moose trapped in the lake between the dock and one of the company's float planes. He couldn't get out. He was stuck right in there. Warren was worried about the little moose, but freeing it wasn't his most immediate concern. The first thing that popped in my head was, "All right, where's Mama?" he said. I turned to my right. There she was, coming right at me. As an Alaskan, Warren is well aware that a moose encounter, especially with a protective mother, can quickly turn dangerous if not deadly. It wasn't quite a charge, but her ears were pinned back, and she was making it known that she wasn't happy about me being in the area, Warren said. I was like, yeah, I'm not dealing with a mama moose today. So he quickly moved behind a nearby shed, keeping it between himself and the moose, then carved a winding path back to his car, weaving behind other parked vehicles to make sure he was never in her direct path. Once safely inside the vehicle, he called his boss, who called the police. By the time the officers arrived 15 minutes later, Warren says the mother moose had wandered a bit further away, likely to protect her other calf. One officer positioned his police cruiser between the moose and the float plane, allowing Warren and another officer to tend to the calf out of the mother's line of sight. The officer actually kind of just grabbed it by the scruff of its neck, and I got its rear end a little bit. We just lifted him straight out. He wasn't tangled in anything. He was just wedged. The rescue, while straightforward, wasn't without its challenges. A waterlogged moose isn't light, said an officer. Once free, the calf appeared frightened and was quivering from the cold, Warren said, but overall it was no worse for wear. He was definitely shaken up. I think he'd been there for several hours. All the energy was completely gone, Warren said. Poor little guy. But once it got its bearings, the calf found its way back to its mother and sibling for a family reunion. After the rescue, the family moose stuck around Warren's workplace for a while as the rescued calf took a nice long nap on the porch. The furry family has since wandered off into the wilderness. And of course, anytime you can rescue a little critter, it makes you feel good. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then we'll talk with Dr. Victor Vogel about what you need to know about mental health issues. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And coming up right after the good news, I'll be talking in detail about a pair of fatal twin-engine crashes that unfortunately occurred this week. But first, let's get to the good news. Congratulations to Cody Mattiello. He writes, I emailed you a little over a year ago that with the support of my amazing wife, I decided after 20 years to make a career change to become a full-time CFI. With only 3 days left on my annual, I got a call from a DPE that he had an opening and it was mine if I could be there the next day. I packed the plane and flew up to Portland, Maine. After a lot of late-night studying, flights, and a blown tire with my instructor, Kevin Burbank, who's been like a second father to me through PPL to CFI, I can finally say I'm a certified flight instructor. I want to thank you for all you do with your podcast. It makes my commute to work like an extra hour of ground every day. I will be making a long overdue donation to Aviation News Talk. Now, where is the CFII episode? Well, first, Cody, congratulations. And check out episode 242, which was the CFII mock check ride with Jason Blair. So one more there for you to listen to during your commute. And congratulations also to Nathan Ballard, who passed his ATP. That's a pretty big deal. Max just wanted to drop a note of thanks for the podcast. You and your consistent weekly podcast have been a staple of my aviation routine since 2020. I recommend Aviation News Talk to everyone I fly with. I received my ATP last week. After all those flight instruction hours I put in with students, along with my curiosity about flying professionally, I went ahead and put the effort in to get my ATP. Well, Nathan, congratulations. And if you have good news you'd like to share, go on out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page and send me an email. Now, unfortunately, we've had a couple of fatal twin-engine crashes this week. One occurred in Albany, New York, when a Piper Navajo, which was registered in Canada, Charlie-Golf Kilo Sierra, India, took off in the morning and crashed within a minute afterwards. Now, I've read that the plane was owned by a company that does survey work, so this may have been a pilot doing time building, working to get the 1,500 hours needed to qualify for an airline job. After takeoff, the aircraft was in the air for just a little over a minute. I listened to the audio from liveatc.net, and there was no call from the pilot describing the trouble he was facing. There's just a call from the tower canceling a takeoff for the next pilot who said that, yes, he had seen what happened. Less than 30 seconds after rotation, the aircraft leveled off at about 300 feet AGL and then descended 100 feet. As it started to turn 45 degrees to the left, it started climbing again, reaching its highest altitude of 600 feet AGL. It then started descending at about 2,200 feet per minute. It leveled off at about 100 feet AGL and again climbed rapidly, this time to 400 feet AGL, while continuing the left turn toward the downwind. It then appeared to lose control in the turn and descended at about 6,000 feet per minute. So it appears this was an intermittent problem with at least one engine and possibly both engines, though that is rare. Now, we've talked in the past about how intermittent engine problems are the worst kind to have, as they offer hope that you might be able to make it back to the airport, whereas a total loss of power makes it very clear what you have to do. In this case, the aircraft was over a large clear area from the time it left the runway through the time when it had its first descent and started to climb again. However, once it reached its highest altitude of 600 feet AGL, it went over a populated area and there were no longer good places to land. Hindsight is, of course, 2020, and as my good friend Rob Marks said, sometimes it just makes sense to close the throttles put the airplane down while you still have it under control. The second crash is the one that I mentioned during the news. That involved November 245 Tango, a Cessna 421 that departed from Longmont, Colorado. According to FlightAware, that aircraft was headed for Ogden, Utah. But about 40 minutes into the trip, the airplane turned right about 90 degrees and headed to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, while starting a slight descent. Now, there's no way to know why the aircraft diverted. I checked on liveatc.net, and while I heard the aircraft announce that he was taking off from Longmont, I couldn't find any subsequent conversations with ATC, though there may well have been. It's just that liveatc.net doesn't record all frequencies, so the pilot may have been talking with ATC, and if they were, we'll learn about that in an NTSB report. It certainly doesn't appear from the ADSB data that there was any major engine trouble. After the turn, the aircraft started a descent from about 16,000 feet to about 14,000 feet at about 600 feet per minute. And there was no decrease in speed, which we typically see when there are engine issues. The aircraft later passed over the airport and then spent the next 18 minutes making a number of changes in direction that included 2 irregularly shaped circles. All of this time was spent north of the airport over higher terrain, and most of the time was spent at between roughly 14,000 and 15,000 feet. The wind at the time was nearly a direct crosswind. The accident occurred at 4:23 p.m. Mountain Time. 8 minutes earlier, the winds were reported at 210 at 8, gusting to 19 knots. 12 minutes after the accident, the wind had increased to 210 at 13 knots, gusting to 19. So while the wind was a 70-degree crosswind, it still favored runway 14. Ultimately, the airplane appeared to line up with runway 14 and started a rapid descent for the runway. It was a controlled, though high-speed descent. The ground speed was around 180 knots, and the descent rate averaged around 2,000 feet per minute, though twice it went up to around 3,500 feet per minute. It looks like the pilot ultimately realized that he was too high and fast to land straight in on runway 14, as he abruptly leveled off at about 7,800 feet, about 1,000 feet above the airport, and then turned about 45 degrees to the right to fly what looks like a left downwind to runway 32. On the base turn, however, he was still at 7,600 feet or 800 feet above the field elevation. Throughout the downwind, the ground speed decreased to 100 knots. During the turn to base, the ground speed decreased to 90 knots. But then, just as the aircraft rolled out on the base heading, the speed dropped below 90 knots and the descent rate reached minus 6,700 feet per minute. The aircraft started turning left and the last recorded airspeed was 56 knots, indicating the aircraft was stalled and likely in a spin. According to SteamboatRadio.com, quote, witnesses reported hearing the plane in a flat spin on approach to the airport. We don't know why the aircraft diverted to Steamboat Springs or what distractions may have been present as the pilot was dealing with landing at an airport he hadn't planned on landing at. Sadly, there have been many stall spin accidents on the base legs of traffic patterns when an aircraft gets too slow and stalls. And on first analysis, this appears to be yet another one of these accidents. Remember, as CFI John Fiskus said last week, airspeed is life, and you can't afford to take your eyes off the airspeed indicator for more than a few seconds when you're descending the traffic pattern. And now let's talk about an incident that occurred with Southwest Airlines back in April, but only came to light publicly a week ago after Bloomberg reported that the company had sent a memo to pilots about the incident. Now, as you know, generally I don't talk about the airlines on this show unless it relates to something relevant to flying general aviation aircraft. And this near accident does relate to flying in all types of aircraft. You've probably heard about the incident in the news, but I want to go into it in more depth than most of the reporting on the incident. This occurred in Hawaii with what we could charitably call a flawed missed approach. It involved Southwest Flight 2786, which was en route to Lihue on the island of Kauai. Rather than climbing on the missed approach, the crew acted in ways that led the aircraft to descend during the missed approach, coming to within 400 feet of the surface at a descent rate that reached 4,400 feet per minute. Now that, of course, was a very close call that could easily have led to a fatal crash. And that's pretty disconcerting when you consider this was a fully trained 737 crew that, by their own admission, did a few things incorrectly. The reason we know the details of what happened is because the crew made an ASAP report, which I'll explain in a moment, to their airline Southwest, and that report was later leaked to the press. I first saw it on John Osterauer's Twitter account, Normally these reports are internal to an airline, but since it had been already published elsewhere in the press, John reported on it, which we'll do here as well to promote understanding of this safety-related issue. First, let me explain ASAP, which is something that we talked a lot about in my Safety Management Systems class that I attended at USC for the past 2 weeks. ASAP stands for Aviation Safety Action Program, and it's a reporting system used by all major airlines. And you can read about it in detail in the FAA's Advisory Circular 120-66C. The objective of an ASAP program is to encourage employees to voluntarily report safety information that may be critical to identifying potential precursors to an accident. It's a voluntary safety program designed to identify hazards and unsafe conditions. And under an ASAP, safety issues are resolved through corrective action rather than punishment or discipline. In fact, as I understand it, the reporting is anonymous so that typically company management won't know who made the report, though the ASAP analyst in the safety department would know. And the company can't take punitive action against the pilots. However, it's not unusual for the union that represents the employees to require a pilot or crew to take some simulator training after an incident occurs, so that's most likely what's going to occur in the wake of this incident. Let me go ahead and read the message, which appears to have been a leaked internal memo from Southwest that says, "To all pilots," and it's from their Director of Flight Safety Programs and Assurance. It says in part, "A recent flight descended excessively while attempting a missed approach in LIH, which is Lihue. Safety data recorded from the event indicated the aircraft's maximum descent rate was minus 4,400 feet per minute, and the aircraft descended to nearly 400 feet RA, which would be the radar altimeter, so height above the ground. The crew recovered from the descent and diverted safely back to their departure airport. No injuries were reported." It says that the crew was assigned a 3-day trip, and it says that on day 2 of the trip, quote, "The crew briefed the entire flight at the gate and discussed the thunderstorms that were developing south of their destination. The first officer also mentioned they were monitoring Flight Radar 24 and noticed multiple aircraft were also performing missed approaches in LIH. Even with the challenging weather conditions being forecasted, the captain elected to have the first officer operate the short leg to LIH to build the first officer's experience. The crew reported light to moderate turbulence throughout the flight. Even with the weather conditions deteriorating, the ATIS and LIH tower reported that weather was at or above minimums for an RNAV 17 approach. The crew briefed the go-around procedure, anticipating they would be unable to see the runway at minimums. As expected, the first officer did not have the runway in sight by minimums and called go-around. Both pilots described the events from the first officer's go-around call to the holding altitude as high workload and task saturated. During the go-around, the first officer inadvertently pushed forward on the control column while following thrust lever movement commanded by the autothrottle. At this point, the first officer noticed the red airspeed tape and pulled back on the thrust levers, resulting in a descent. Safety data confirmed the crew received a "don't sink" JIPS aural warning, followed by a "pull-up" JIPS aural warning. The first officer later stated that they did not hear the warnings due to the intense task saturation. The captain assessed that the aircraft was in an undesirable state based on the JIPS warnings and verbalized climb and turn left immediately, prompting the first officer to increase the thrust. The aircraft climbed aggressively during the recovery, maxing out at plus 8,500 feet per minute. As the aircraft climbed, neither pilot noticed activation of flap load relief from 15 to 10 degrees as a result of the increasing airspeed. This resulted in a Phase 2 flap overspeed. The maximum speed recorded was 238 knots above the posted flaps 10 maximum speed of 210 knots, and the Phase 2 limit of 225 knots. During the aggressive maneuvers, the first officer unsuccessfully attempted to reconnect the autopilot due to the heavy control forces. Additionally, the crew exceeded the missed approach altitude by nearly 700 feet. After recovering the hold, the crew determined the best course of action was to return to their departure airport. Now, it says that they later made a second attempt to fly to Lihue, this time with the captain being the pilot flying. They were given holding, the weather got worse, so they did attempt to fly a second approach, and they returned to their departure airport. Getting back to the report, it says the crew participated in an ASAP and human factors interview, during which each pilot was individually shown an animation of the event flight, allowing them to debrief freely. Neither pilot could recall the event's parameters and stated that they were both task saturated during the missed approach. Both pilots stated seeing the severity of the event through the animations was a significant emotional event. The crew participated in the comprehensive corrective actions, including line experience. Initial takeaways from this event included the importance of creating a shared mental model for the approach and any possible missed approach, performing proper pilot monitoring, and maintaining VVMI, which, by the way, stands for Verbalize, Verify, Monitor, and Intervene, were also identified as critical to effective risk management. As part of our SMS process, leaders and subject matter experts across flight ops and NOC are reviewing industry and internal data and trends related to our procedures, training, standards, and performance. Additionally, focus groups conducted in a subset of bases, and they mentioned BNA, BWI, LAX, and OAK, will provide insight into the unique experience felt across the front line, as well as the understanding crews have of responsibilities in the flight deck. After completing our analysis, we'll share a summary of our findings from these and other similar safety events. We commend this crew for their professionalism in participating in ASAP to help us learn more about this event and to prevent similar incidents. And there's an extensive discussion about this incident on the pprune.org forum. Also, a number of people posted subsets of the ADS-B data for the flight there. Now, the crew was flying the RNAV GPS-17 approach. It's the only approach to that runway, and it's a non-precision approach with relatively high minimums. The LNAV MDA is 940 feet, which is 842 feet AGL. However, the MDA is not particularly relevant as the issues on this flight occurred after the crew reached the MDA and began their missed approach in the 737. Looking at a plot of altitude versus airspeed, you can see that the aircraft is flying level at the MDA for about 8 seconds before it begins a descent. During the next 10 seconds, it drops down to 400 feet MSL before it begins a very rapid climb. During that brief descent, the aircraft reached a descent rate of minus 4,400 feet per minute. What's really interesting is the airspeed. The airspeed was relatively constant on the approach at about 145 knots until the aircraft reached the MDA. As soon as it reached the MDA, the airspeed immediately started to increase because the thrust levers were coming up, but the aircraft was flying straight and level. While level at the MDA for about 8 seconds, the airspeed did an almost linear increase from 145 knots to about 185 knots. At this point, the aircraft started a sharp descent, and the airspeed continued to rise again in a linear fashion. It went from 185 to 235 knots, reaching that maximum speed just moments after the aircraft reversed direction and started to climb again. Now, you may be wondering, how the heck could this happen? First, remember that the crew was in IMC at the MDA and would not have had any outside references. Next, recall that the leaked memo said, quote, during the go-around, the first officer inadvertently pushed forward on the control column while following thrust lever movement commanded by the auto throttle. So you might be wondering, why did he push forward? In most aircraft, when you're trimmed for approach speed or for best glide speed if you're practicing an engine-out emergency, when you add full power, the aircraft is going to pitch up. And usually it's going to pitch up much more than you want it to. And if you don't push forward on the yoke or stick, the aircraft pitches up way too high and you can quickly get to stall speed. So the co-pilot probably needed to be applying some forward pressure on the yoke. However, as I understand it, during the go-around procedure in a 737, you need to pitch the nose up to 15 degrees, but apparently the first officer was applying too much forward pressure and remained level instead of pitching up. Since the aircraft wasn't pitching up, as the auto throttle brought the thrust levers up, the aircraft was accelerating while it was straight and level. And when the human body is accelerated, what illusion occurs? We talked about it before, and it's the illusion that brought down Atlas Air Flight 3591, which we talked about in detail in episode 156. That flight was normal until the 767 suddenly plummeted from 6,000 feet into a bay near Houston. And that event started when the first officer accidentally engaged GA or go-around mode, which caused the aircraft to accelerate while level. And the illusion we're talking about is somatogravic illusion. And as I explained in 156, somatogravic illusion occurs when the human body is accelerated and a pilot perceives incorrectly that their head is tilting backwards, which they incorrectly perceive as a pitch up or climb. For the Atlas Air incident, The NTSB calculated that because of somatogravic illusion, it felt to the pilots equivalent to a nose pitch up attitude of 80 degrees or nearly straight up. So you can imagine if you didn't look at the instruments, your instinct would be to push forward very hard. And that's probably why the first officer in Southwest 2786 was pushing so far forward on the control column and started descending at 4,400 feet per minute, when both pilots clearly knew they were supposed to be climbing for their missed approach. Now, I've written and presented a lot about somatogravic illusion, and I even succeeded in getting the FAA to include it as a required oral check ride topic in the private PTS released in 2011, though for some reason they pulled it from the ACS version released a couple of years later. So today a pilot can get through pilot training without coming across somatogravic illusion. So this is why as pilots, we need to be curious. We want to learn as much as we can about aviation because you never know what small detail, like somatogravic illusion, might save your life. And here's a quick mental math quiz for you. If you're at 400 feet and you're descending at 4,400 feet per minute, how long do you have to live? Yes, about 9 seconds. That's how close this flight came to becoming an accident that would surely have killed everyone on board. And when the crew recovered, they were climbing at over 8,000 feet per minute, which they were able to get away with briefly because of the aircraft's excess airspeed. And think for a moment about how many times when flying as a passenger on an airliner, the aircraft has done a go-around. I remember for sure it happening to me once and maybe twice, so go-arounds occur very infrequently. Which reminds me of what a local retired airline pilot told me a few years ago. He said, "Max, whenever we have to do a go-around for real, we almost always forget something. Simply because they do so few go-arounds, except when they're in the simulator once or twice a year." Frankly, I find this all very sobering, and I hope your takeaway from this is 1, that you should practice go-arounds often, and 2, that when you're accelerating, somatogravic illusion can fool you into thinking that you're climbing dramatically when you're really straight and level or even descending, so please keep that in mind. And in a bizarre coincidence, I woke up on Friday morning to find that the very first story in the news was that a Southwest flight had descended as low as 400 feet 2 days ago while I was still 9 miles away from the Will Rogers World Airport. Jeez, this is pretty amazing. So we don't have a lot of details on this, but here's what the story says on KFOR.com, which is Channel 4 out of Oklahoma City. It says the FAA is looking into what caused a Southwest Boeing 737 to get within several hundred feet above the ground over the city of Yukon earlier this week. Now, Yukon's a suburb northwest of Oklahoma City. Flight data shows Southwest Flight 4069, a Boeing 737-800, en route to Oklahoma City from Las Vegas, flew as low as 400 feet above the city of Yukon just about 12 a.m. Wednesday morning while on a final approach to Will Rogers World Airport. ATC audio obtained by News 4 indicated that the plane flew so low it triggered an altitude alert in the Will Rogers World Airport control tower. The plane hit its lowest altitude while flying over Yukon High School at 12:06 a.m. Wednesday. It was loud enough to wake up Spencer Bozico, who lives a few blocks from the school. I was kind of like halfway in between sleep being awake, and I heard this whoosh, Bosco told News 4, and I thought at first like a storm was blowing in because it just sounded like a wall of wind. And I looked out the window where the sound was coming from. If you go a few blocks away is the high school, and I just see a plane. A News 4 viewer shared video of the plane captured by his doorbell camera. It shows lights blinking on a jetliner flying low above a neighborhood a good distance from the viewer's house before becoming obscured behind the roofs of nearby homes. I knew it wasn't normal, Basasco said. In ATC audio obtained by News 4, it was indicated that the plane's pilots intended to land on runway 13, a crosswind runway, going diagonally across the airfield at Will Rogers World Airport. As the plane flew hundreds of feet, and by the way, I looked it up, it was 425 feet, so it was pretty low above the Yukon High School. An air traffic controller can be heard telling the pilot his plane set off a low-altitude alert in the tower. At that point, the plane was still 9 miles away from the runway. Southwest 4069 low-altitude alert, the controller said. "You doing okay?" "Yeah, we're going around 4069, the pilot responded. At that moment, the plane was only 400 to 500 feet above the ground. "To me, that's way too low," KFOR Chopper 4 pilot Mason Dunn said. Even if he's lined up on the wrong runway, he's extremely low out there. After receiving the low altitude alert, flight records show the plane quickly gained altitude, climbing from about 450 feet above the ground when it crossed over the northern edge of Yukon High School's property to more than 1,000 feet above ground by the time it crossed the southern edge of the property. Flight records indicated the plane then circled around and reapproached the airport from the north, eventually landing on runway 17 right, a different runway that runs north-south. The next time the plane got below 500 feet was within 1 mile of runway 17 right on its final landing approach. Being this low over a residential area is not normal, Dunn said. He doesn't get that low again until he's a mile from the airport. News 4 reached out to Southwest Airlines. In a statement, Southwest spokesperson said Southwest Flight 4069 landed safely at Will Rogers in Oklahoma City just after 12 a.m. on June 19th. Southwest is following its robust safety management system and is in contact with the FAA to understand and address any irregularities with the aircraft's approach to the airport. Nothing is more important to Southwest than the safety of our customers and employees. And I looked at the ground track for this flight, and it looks like it's set up on fairly normal descent rate, about 600 feet per minute as if we're coming into land. And if it's 400 feet over the Yukon High School, that means that its touchdown point would have been pretty close to the intersection of Interstate 344, which runs north-south, and Highway 4, which runs, in fact, almost straight toward the airport. Now, they were not lined up exactly on Highway 4. They were offset by about 1/10 of a mile, so about 600 feet. So it's kind of unclear what happened. My guess is, since they were pretty much on the correct path toward the airport, that they were backing up the approach electronically, but that somehow the intersection of the interstate appeared to them to be the airport, and they were descending straight to that point rather than to the airport that was still 9 miles away. So all I can say is, everybody out there, let's please be careful when we're flying. Anytime you're flying at night, you really want to back up your approach with the instruments and use those instruments to confirm that you're actually headed for the airport that you intend to be landing at. And one more thought, I just looked at Google Maps again. It is interesting that Highway 4 and the interstate form nearly an identical intersection to the runways at Oklahoma City. So my guess is they thought that intersection was the airport. And it was after midnight, so pilots get tired. It's pretty easy to make that kind of mistake. And since we'll be talking in a few minutes about mental health issues, I wanted to read this story that came out on AvWeb a couple of weeks ago. It's about mental health evaluation and how that criteria has changed for pilots. It says, the history of no more than 2 mental health diagnoses no longer requires automatic review by the FAA for any class of pilot certificate as long as certain criteria are met. The agency has revised its guidance to AMEs on uncomplicated anxiety, depression, and related conditions. And chief among the changes is the FAA can be left out of the process if the pilot has been off medication for 2 years, there are no issues raised by a questionnaire, and the AME has no concerns. The questionnaire deals with serious mental health issues like suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and whether or not the pilot has been hospitalized or been under court-ordered evaluation, and it reminds the AME to be thorough and conservative in his or her judgment. Quote, and this comes from the form, if all items fall into the no/clear column, the AME may issue with notes in Block 60, which show the AME discuss the history of uncomplicated anxiety, depression, and related conditions, found no positives to the screening questions, and had no concerns. The new guidance reads, if any single item falls into the yes/shaded column, the AME must defer. So in that case, the AME would not be able to issue the medical certificate on the spot. And I also noticed a few days ago a poll on AvWeb which says, have you experienced mental health issues as a pilot? And let me just go ahead and read the results. It said 8% said yes, and I lost my certificate. 6% said yes, and I hid it from my AME. 2% said yes, but I have my certificate back. 78% said no, and 5% said other. Of course, this is not a scientific survey at all, as the participants who answered opted in themselves, and this was not a random sample, so we really can't draw any conclusions from this. And I want to mention a book that was recommended to me last week when I was in my Safety Management Systems course at USC. Dr. Kay Snyder, who is both an AME and a DPE, recommended the book Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. And his point was, hey, if you read this book, you'll make sure that you try and get a good night's sleep every night. I mean, one of the key findings is that people who don't sleep 7-8 hours a night, they don't live as long. And so I wish somebody had told that to me a really long time ago, because I've often burned the midnight oil and had short nights, but I'm working on trying to improve that. So check that out. I'll include a link in the show notes where you can find that on Amazon.com. And before we get to our conversation with Victor Vogel, I'd like to ask, if you've been listening to the show for a while, please consider signing up to support the show. You just heard Cody Mattiello mention this as being another hour of ground instruction for himself each day. So you might consider ground instruction and consider what you would pay for an hour of time with an instructor in an airplane, and send a donation either on a monthly basis or a one-time donation to help support the show. It's so easy to do. So I ask you, please stop what you're doing for just a moment, because if you don't, you'll probably forget and won't get to this later. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you can choose 4 different options for signing up to support the show. Thanks so very much for your help. And aviation is a very small community, so take a moment to see if you know any of these people who signed up in the past week to support the show. First, my thanks to our new mega supporter, Jules Myers. And of course, the mega supporters are those people who donate $50 a month, and after 2 months, they'll get a signed copy of one of my books, and they also get access to my online courses. Also want to thank both Gabor Simon and Aaron Weisblatt, who signed up via Patreon. And we also had some people sign up to support the show via PayPal. First, my thanks to Nick, who has signed up to support the show via a monthly donation. He says this donation is on behalf of Blaze Grubs and his West Coast Flyer channel on YouTube. He says that Blaze flies both a Vision Jet and a Pilatus. So Nick, thanks so much for signing up to support the show. We also had some one-time donations from David Lepka and from Alan Miller, who I think is related to one of the people sitting next to me in my class at USC last week. So thanks to everyone who supports the show, however you do. Coming up next, our conversation with Dr. Victor Vogel about mental health issues for pilots. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Dr. Victor Vogel. He's been a pilot for 45 years. He's a CFI and CFII and a member of the NAFI Board of Directors. He also founded and is president of the Susquehanna STEM to the Skies, an educational public charity that promotes science and math education in public schools. And now here's our conversation with Dr. Victor Vogel. Victor, welcome to the show. So great to have you back here again today.
Max, it's great to be back with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, we're talking about something today which I think pilots in general try to avoid thinking and talking about, but I hope we're going to hold their attention because we've got some really important things to talk about. You wrote an article recently for NAFI Mentor magazine talking about clinical aspects of pilots' mental health. Talk a little bit about some of the things that have been going on in the last year or two that tells us that mental health is a serious issue for pilots.
Yeah, and it's very sobering, and this has been going on for longer than just the past few years. And one of the accidents that got everyone's attention was a flight in Europe on an airline called Germanwings, and this was in March of 2015, when an Airbus 320 that was piloted by a captain and a first officer who was younger, he was 27 years old, and the captain had left the cockpit, and the first officer had a history of suicidal tendencies, and his primary care physician had declared him unfit to work because of his mental health condition. And yet the primary care physician didn't report this, and this young first officer didn't report it. He locked the cabin door, hadn't told the airline about his history of depression and suicidal tendency, and flew this airliner, which had 144 passengers and 6 crew, and flew it on this flight from Barcelona to, I forget where they were going, but he flew it into the French Alps, and everyone on board perished. And that certainly got everyone's attention. And we'll get back to what action that prompted from the FAA. But there have also been a series of recent tragic accidents involving pilots and flight instructors. There was one in October of 2021 that involved a student who was at the University of North Dakota, and he was there on a presidential scholarship, on track to become a professional pilot, and he committed suicide in an airplane. And then there was another event that got a lot of notoriety because it was shown on a series of YouTube videos of a flight instructor in Kentucky last September of 2023, who was abusive to a student and recorded all this on an Instagram post and was exhibiting a number of dangerous behaviors. And he and the student were out on a night flight with these hazardous attitudes that the flight instructor had demonstrated. And at night, with convective weather all around, the flight instructor flew himself and the student into a thunderstorm, and they both died in that crash. And then finally, there was an event just this year, a few months ago, in January of this year, of a young 23-year-old student at a flight school in Dallas at the Addison Airport. And he took off in the evening and climbed. And while he was climbing, he talked to the Addison Tower and essentially told them who he was and that his intention was that he was going to end his life, and turned off the radios, did not communicate with the tower. And ADSB showed him in a descent of over 4,700 feet per minute, and he crashed and died. So all of these incidents are very, very sobering and raise this issue about what should we be doing about these very obvious and somewhat prevalent incidents of pilots' mental health impacting themselves and others. And as a result of the Germanwings crash, the FAA in May of 2015, after the Germanwings incident, they established this aviation rulemaking committee, which was designed to evaluate the issues surrounding pilot mental health. And we can talk more about that as we go on here.
Sure. And I just want to say that in terms of mental health, you've just talked about some of the absolute worst kinds of things related to mental health. And yet there's probably a whole much lower level that's even more common and more prevalent. So I guess we don't want people to think that if you have some mental health issues, it leads to suicide.
No, it's not all about suicide. And we'll talk about some of those mental health issues and very common things like depression and anxiety, and depression that we call reactive. When we go through life events, losses like death of a family member or a friend, or divorce, or a business collapse, and financial stresses and childhood concerns, all of these things. And it's a whole spectrum, and not all of these things are disabling. But the point is, we need to become aware that many of us are affected with these things, and there are things that we can do to manage those illnesses. And the FAA has now clear recommendations from this aviation rulemaking committee about how the aviation community should address these issues.
Right. And we'll get to talking later on about how AMEs deal with them when you go for your medical. So talk a little bit about what happened in the wake of the Germanwings accident here in the U.S. in Congress.
Well, first of all, Senator Feinstein, she asked that the Inspector General create a report to look into the factors related to these accidents that might be related to pilot mental health. And that prompted the creation of this aviation rulemaking committee. And as early as November of 2015, they published a pilot fitness report that said that we should in the aviation community and with the cooperation of FAA, create an environment that would encourage pilots to voluntarily self-disclose their mental illness. And there are a number of barriers that prevent that from happening. There's this culture we have in the United States about mental illness being some sort of a character deficiency, or that there's something wrong with a person who has a mental illness or some sort of mental health symptoms. And we need to rethink that. Having mental illness is no different than having heart disease or diabetes or kidney problems. We need to think of it as illness and remove the culture and stigma around mental health. And we also need to start fostering trust in both the mental health system, the FAA, the pilot community, to eliminate the fear that surrounds the disclosure of mental health history, because it has potential financial implications. If a pilot believes that his or her disclosure of mental health issues would lead to a loss of certificate, a loss of a medical, if you're a professional pilot, it could mean loss of your livelihood. But even if you're a private pilot, just flying for enjoyment, and you're not being paid to fly, you fear that you may lose your certificate if you disclose mental health issues. And so all of these things have come to play. And that is what the Rules Committee asked that the FAA address beginning as far back as 2015. And that eventually resulted in this report that was just the final report from the Aviation Rulemaking Committee on Mental Health, what was issued on April 1st of this year. And we can talk about that after we talk about how prevalent mental health issues are in the United States.
Yeah, and there's no question that this has been a huge issue here in the U.S. Pilots have been reluctant to report for a variety of reasons. And it's clear that the FAA is moving slowly, getting better to try and make it less burdensome on pilots if they do report. But go ahead, tell us more about this.
Yeah, so the sobering fact is that if you look at the data from reliable sources like the National Institute of Mental Health, who does surveys and assesses the prevalence of mental health issues in our population, in 2021, which is the last year that we have reliable data for, but the data are still valid and no reason to think they've changed significantly. But in 2021, it was estimated that among adults 18 and older, there were almost 58 million people in the United States with any mental illness. And that's nearly 23% of all U.S. adults. So every year in the United States, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the adult population have some signs or symptoms of mental illness. And the data suggests that maybe there's a little more in women than in men, but that has to be carefully assessed because of the likelihood that women have more frequent contact with the healthcare system for things like childbearing and issues related to women's physical health. And so it is very likely that the incidence of mental health issues is nearly the same in men and women. And also very interesting, especially to those of us who do flight instruction, among young adults 18 to 25 years of age, they had the highest prevalence of any mental illness in a given year, and it was about a third, over 33% of young adults 18 to 25 had evidence of mental illness. And even if you go into older adults, young to middle age, say 26 to 49 years, more than a quarter of them, 28%, had mental health issues in any given year. And among us mature folks, 50 and over, it was still about 15%. So there's a very, very high prevalence of these illnesses in the United States. And then you might ask, well, how prevalent is it among pilots? Well, it's difficult to get data in pilots, but the data that are available in 2016 among airline pilots who were surveyed anonymously, 12%, 1 in 8 airline pilots said that they were managing depression, and 4% of airline pilots in this 2016 study said they had suicidal thoughts and were not receiving treatment because they feared negative impacts on their career. And an updated study in 2019 said that pilots avoid seeking health care more than a third because they feared they would lose their medical certificate. And again, these are some of the concerns and issues that the Aviation Rulemaking Committee has addressed, being fully aware that this sort of reporting problem is prevalent in the pilot population.
Yeah, that's interesting. The airline pilot studies, both of those were before the pandemic. And as you and I have talked in the past, I think the pandemic actually made things a little bit worse in terms of mental health in this country. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, there is evidence that said that there was an increase in the prevalence. So if you look, for example, in 2019, among young adults, 35 to 44, it was about 31% said that they had received a mental health diagnosis in 2019, 31%, about a third. But in 2023, now 4 years later, obviously through the pandemic, that number went from 31% to 45%. And among middle-aged adults, older middle-aged adults, 45 to 64 years of age, in 2019, only 26% reported a mental health diagnosis. But in 2023, that 26% had increased to 36%. So there was some obvious effect of transitioning through the pandemic that led to an increase of the reporting of mental health diagnoses. And these data are fairly reliable. They're from the American Psychological Association that were just released last November. So I think we can believe that mental health issues are prevalent, they're common, and in recent years that their prevalence has increased.
So tell us a little bit about the mental health conditions that AMEs are looking for and what they're required to do when they identify them.
So there are certain conditions that an aviation medical examiner would not issue a medical certificate for. And these are people with things like personality disorders where they are exhibited with overt acts, with psychosis, that is the inability to test reality effectively, so-called bipolar disorder, manic depressive disorder with great swings in mood from very high to very low, particularly people with substance dependence without recovery or abstinence. And if you were a substance abuser, you can get a medical certificate, but you have to be abstinent for 2 years. And so evidence of substance abuse would be disqualifying. And there are not to be other things like personality disorders, severe neuroses, or mental conditions that, in the opinion of the AME, would affect the ability of the pilot to perform their tasks. So those things are pretty clear. But there's things that all of us have, especially as older folks. And the Mayo Clinic refers to these minor changes in our cognitive ability as mild cognitive impairment. Things like asking the same questions over and over again or telling the same old stories over and over again. Well, we all have older relatives who every time we see them at Christmas, they tell us the same stories they've been telling us for the last 10 years, or missing appointments, or losing one's train of thought. You know, how many times have I lost my train of thought or couldn't remember why I walked into a room to find something? Or all of us at times have felt depressed or anxious or frustrated or irritable. That's not mental illness. That's cognitive impairment. And those things are not obviously disqualifying. But when you start developing serious symptoms like feeling sad or down all the time, or being confused, or having fears and worries that are they're inappropriate because they're not matching the actual challenges or hazards that we face, or if we have these extreme mood changes from high to low, or we withdraw from activities, or we're always tired, or we're delusional, or we have obvious hallucinations, or can't cope with the daily problems, the daily challenges we all face, or obviously alcohol or drug use, then we get into lifestyle changes like changes in eating habits, or in our sexual behavior, or having excessive anger or hostility. Those are the kinds of things that raise the flag and say, is there something here that might need professional attention? And the American Psychiatric Association says, well, if you've got significant sleep or appetite changes, or mood changes, or you become withdrawn, or you have a drop in functioning so you're not able to perform your daily activities, or you can't think clearly, or you're overly sensitive to the normal stimuli of occurrences of everyday activity, or you've just given up and say, well, you don't want to do anything, you don't have a desire to participate in activities, or you feel disconnected from your environment. For a student who drops out of their training program, or starts to have repeated absences and seems to have problems with concentration, these are the sorts of signals that suggest that someone may need professional mental health attention.
Well, you've listed many things, and I'm sure people have probably heard one or two where they thought, oh, I'm like that some of the time. You're talking about people who are doing in these conditions for longer periods of time, right?
Yeah, and we all have those kinds of symptoms and reactions. I mean, when I was a young 39-year-old oncologist and my 63-year-old mother died from acute leukemia, I was depressed for weeks. Now, I probably, in retrospect, should have taken more time off. I mean, I was able to function, but I was clearly depressed because I had suffered a significant loss. And those kinds of things are common. We all have losses of various kinds. We have situations that are distressing or anxiety-provoking that elicit all sorts of emotions, and those things are normal. Now, we have to all self-assess our ability to fly every time we think about getting in an airplane, and if those signs and symptoms lead us to believe that our ability to do things safely is impaired, well, then we should restrict ourselves. So those kinds of normal reactions to the vicissitudes and the changes of life are normal. But if they become prevalent and overbearing and chronic, and particularly if we as pilots see these symptoms in other pilots, or we who are flight instructors see them in our learners or in other pilots who we observe, we really have the obligation to encourage them to seek input from mental health professionals.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight that for these brief periods of time, and by brief, it may be, weeks or a month or something like that, where people may have suffered a significant loss, probably not a great time to go fly in the airplane. I remember that AOPA put out a video, and I actually met the gentleman involved, in which he had lost a parent and went flying a week or so later, and everything went fine, but then went flying a day or two after that and had an accident on the water in which he landed with the gear down, which resulted in a fatality in the airplane, though he survived. So yeah, key takeaway from that was that even though he felt he was recovered well enough to fly, he realized afterwards he hadn't really recovered well enough from his loss to be able to deal with distractions in flight. So I think that we're really asking people, make sure you're not just 95% better when you go fly. You really want to be 98, 99% better so that you can deal with these non-standard things that may come up in a flight.
And the other thing is we shouldn't judge anyone who has those sorts of symptoms of depression or anxiety or fearfulness. I mean, these are all part of our lives. And as we saw in those data we just recounted, these are very prevalent. 1 in 5 of us every year has some sort of mental health symptoms because that's what life does. We have to encounter and deal with many, many challenging situations. And one of the things that the Aviation Rulemaking Committee recommended to FAA is we all work to remove this stigma that somehow people who have these symptoms are somehow bad people. They're not good people, or they're weak, or something's wrong with them. No, this happens to all of us, and this is something that we need to recognize as being just part of our human experience.
You had a section in your article called CFI Actions to Promote and Protect Pilots' Mental Health. If you would go ahead and read through each of those bullets.
So I think we all need to be aware of these signs and symptoms that we've talked about, this sadness or confused thinking or excessive fear, all those things that we mentioned. And the CFI or even other pilots who observe this in their pilot colleagues, be alert to those signs and symptoms. And as we just said, we need to regard mental illness like any other medical condition. I mean, we wouldn't judge harshly someone who was just diagnosed with hypertension or diabetes or kidney failure. We wouldn't say that there was some sort of moral problem with that. And the same thing should be true for mental illness. We should be able to regard mental illness like any other medical condition and to avoid the stigma. And then it may just be a matter of listening. If you see or encounter someone who's just suffered a significant loss, a parent who's lost a child, an adult who's going through divorce or separation, or somehow they've had financial difficulties, oftentimes all they need is someone to hear their story. And when we see someone who we think is really impaired, where they just aren't able to function normally, or they're having overt signs and symptoms, we need to encourage them to see their primary physician or to consult professional health from a mental health counselor. Some of these problems are spiritual problems. They could see a spiritual advisor, a psychiatrist, or a clinical psychologist. And if we are very much concerned and we have the pilot's consent, it is certainly appropriate to notify the pilot's aviation medical examiner and to ask the pilot to see their aviation medical examiner, who might be the first step in helping to find treatment and resolution of mental health symptoms.
I liked your bullet about offering a compassionate listening ear. As a flight instructor, sometimes I think that half of what I'm doing is listening and being compassionate and kind of attending to the psychological needs of the person who's undergoing flight training. And I think that's just an important part for people to remember. This is not just about teaching people how to land an airplane. It's really being more involved in their lives. I'm always amazed at some of the things that people tell me that I'm sure they don't tell other people, but there we are sitting side by side. It becomes a close relationship. So I think CFIs shouldn't shy away from addressing issues that they may see that go beyond just the mechanics of flying an airplane.
Yeah, and the other thing I think we can do, and we shouldn't be reluctant to do this if necessary, if we as flight instructors or as pilots who are not flight instructors see or hear from a pilot and they make a suggestion that they're having suicidal thoughts, especially if they have a plan. If someone says, I'm going to go out and kill myself in the airplane, or I'm going to take an overdose of drugs, or I'm going to shoot myself, that is a medical emergency. That's the same as witnessing a cardiac arrest. And we wouldn't stand by and do nothing in those situations. Well, the same is true if someone is exhibiting overt suicidal thinking and behavior. We should either have them call 911 or we can call 911. And something I learned as I was doing my research to learn more about mental illness is that there is a national suicide hotline, and anywhere in the country, you can dial 988. It's very similar to dialing 911, but if you dial 988, that is the suicide and crisis lifeline, and it's available 24/7. And that's certainly something that we should keep in mind if we see someone who's exhibiting suicidal thoughts, and especially if they have a plan to carry out a suicidal event. And then we can also reach out to their primary care provider, to a friend or loved one, to their family members, to their spiritual leader or faith community. The thing is, it's just kind of like airport security, Max. It's, if you see something, say something. And if we see or witness overt behavior that is a threat to the pilot, then we should do something. And that is, we should help them seek advice, guide them to these resources, call 911, call 988, get in touch with their family or their care providers. But importantly, we should not ignore these kinds of overt symptoms. And that's a very important message in all of this.
And if a pilot who's listening has identified any of these symptoms in themselves and they feel like, oh, this is not just a temporary, few weeks of depression or whatever it may be, then certainly it makes sense to start by talking to a spouse or a friend or someone who can listen. But if they decide to go beyond that, what kinds of professionals would you recommend they contact?
Well, there are many communities, particularly larger communities, where there are clinical psychologists who are very well versed in this and very, very helpful. It is a little more difficult in many communities to find access to psychiatrists, but often the initial contact can be through clinical psychologists. Many healthcare systems also have qualified nurse practitioners or other non-doctoral specialists who can do the intake and assessment and decide who would best serve the healthcare needs of a person with these kinds of symptoms. So most healthcare systems have a place where you can address them, ask for mental health services, and they will get you into the system at some level. And then depending on the severity of the symptoms, you can work your way up through whatever professionals are required.
Yeah, you raise a good point, which is that when you get outside metro areas, rural parts of the country, it may be more difficult to find some of these professionals. One of the things that I think became more common in the pandemic was online mental health services. Talk about some of these.
There's a ready resource that's available for affected individuals. There's something called the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline. It's a 1-800 number. It's 800-950-6264. And that helpline is staffed 24/7, and they can help people who are outside of metropolitan areas, and they can make referrals to resources that can be helpful. And they also have a helpline where you can send a text. If you send a text to 62640, they will put you into free and confidential support services that can get you started with professionals that can be helpful. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline, 1-800-950-6264, or send a text message to the helpline and send that text message to 62640, and they can offer you help as well.
That's super. Yeah, one of the things I'm often telling, especially new clients when I start to fly with them, is that for the normal kinds of stresses that we feel in everyday life, flying is absolutely fantastic for those. Definitely go flying, because the way you are spending a couple hours in the air, it's hard to think about all your problems back down on Earth. And actually, after you land, that good feeling sticks with you for a couple of hours as well.
That's true, Max. And I was a medical oncologist, and I took care of women with breast cancer for 36 years. And it could be stressful for me at times. And I found flying was absolutely therapeutic. It was a wonderful relief and separation from the challenges of taking care of young, dying women. And I told my wife very often, there's no breast cancer in my airplane. It all went away. And so, yeah, there's some therapeutics in flying. And I hope I never flew at a time when I was worried or distressed about the health or well-being of my patients. But I really do believe that it was a therapeutic activity for me to get in the airplane and to forget about medical oncology for a few hours.
Yeah, I used to joke sometimes that flying was cheaper than getting psychiatry, and that it was more effective. So now, of course, the flip side of all that is, if you've got some type of chronic condition and you're feeling severe stress in whatever way, then that's not the time to be flying. So flying is great for relieving normal everyday stresses, but not for dealing with really huge, deep crisis types of things.
Yeah, and perhaps, Max, we can talk briefly about some of the recommendations that were made by the Aviation Rulemaking Committee and some of the, what I believe are very helpful suggestions that they gave not only to FAA, but to the entire pilot and flying community that will help to deal with these mental health issues.
Sure, go ahead.
So, one of the first things they addressed was that we encourage pilots and the whole aviation community to be able to have psychotherapy, particularly short-term talk therapy for an acute depression or something reactive to a life situation, that we should be able to do that without having to report it. And even in those situations where we are reporting, to make the reporting non-punitive. In other words, there shouldn't be serious consequences from saying, well, I had some mental health issues, I sought help with a mental health professional, and they were taken care of. They advised and encouraged that we develop peer support programs, that we pilots and all of the alphabet groups, which were well represented on the ARC committee. There were airline pilots and AOPA, EAA, all of those groups were well represented on the ARC committee. And even things like the Teamsters and the AFL-CIO that deal with workers' rights were represented on the committee. And they all enthusiastically recommended that we do better in terms of peer support to encourage us to help each other, to lend that listening ear that we were talking about a bit ago. And to deal with things like post-traumatic stress disorder. There are veterans who are flying. There are pilots who because of their military histories may be victims of post-traumatic stress disorder. Then there were recommendations that we ease the restrictions that may be related to that diagnosis, and that we recognize that there are gradients of mental health problems and of mental illness, and that things that are mild and not severe, things that aren't like psychosis or bipolar disorder, that those mild cases should be able to return to flying as soon as their symptoms resolve, and there shouldn't be a carryover or a latent effect of those mild activities. And that we should, the whole community, the medical community, the AME community, what the ARC referred to as the stakeholders, that there should be a safety management system framework. In other words, we should assess risk associated with mental health just the way we associate risks associated with any other kind of flying. And within the context of an objective safety management system, we should be able to manage mental health issues in that context. And that the FAA then should evaluate prospectively the impact of these mental health conditions. If we encourage pilots to report and be honest about their symptoms, then we should then start to be able to longitudinally affect the impact of those diagnoses. We should be encouraging, as the ARC did, the FAA to be objective and to publish the criteria that would allow someone to return to flying after a diagnosis. And they should modernize, that is, the FAA should modernize the data management system. I recently had a student pilot who was 65 years old. He was working on his private pilot certificate, and he had had a cardiac stent placed in one of his coronary arteries. And to make a long story short, it took us 18 months to get his Class 3 medical as it wound its way through the system. And one of the things that the ARC committee recommended was that we modernize and improve the data submission and the data review that occurs when pilots have mental health conditions, so that there's not this long delay of getting them back to flying once they're healthy. They also recommended that we have an annual FAA summit on mental health, and that we improve the education of pilots and the public about mental health issues. And I think that is a tremendously useful recommendation. And hopefully what we're doing here today will start the community on that path to better information about mental health. And the ARC committee also recommended that we do better training of our professionals, our medical professionals, both primary care physicians and aviation medical examiners, to clarify these issues related to mental health so that there's no uncertainty about it. And recently, FAA has relaxed, for example, the rules regarding the use of drugs for depression, the so-called SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, commonly used for depression. There are now 3 of those drugs that are acceptable to be used for the treatment of depression. And we need to continue to see those kinds of assessments that will get pilots safely back to flying. And finally, most of our insurance doesn't regard mental health as a disability. And one of the final recommendations from the ARC committee was that all of our aviation communities and all of our stakeholders start to address this issue of temporary disability for people with mental health conditions, that just like if you have a disability with a hip replacement or a medical illness like a heart attack or you need bypass surgery, those conditions are temporarily disqualifying, but we get those people back to health and they may be temporarily disabled. And those kinds of physical conditions are covered with disability insurance. But one of the ARC recommendations was that we consider having disability insurance for mental health conditions, which would then, I believe, remove some of the stigma or the reluctance to report these sorts of conditions. So it's a whole range of activities, but I think the ARC report is going to go a long way at improving our entire profession's understanding and acceptance of mental health issues, and hopefully we'll get pilots to the resources they need to deal with their mental health illnesses.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of one challenge that I had when I was probably in my 30s, and that was that I realized that I had a really hard time asking people for help. And I don't know if it was just because I was taught to have strong self-reliance, but it was something that I had to actually practice. And I think a key takeaway here today for people would be that in general, pilots are probably not great at asking for help when they encounter mental kinds of issues. And yet these are important things, and that we should deal with them early and not wait until they become more severe.
And again, not to overemphasize this, but we wouldn't tell anyone with hypertension or diabetes or arthritis or any condition, gastrointestinal problems, all those conditions, we would tell somebody, well, see a physician and get treatment and get back to health. That's the sort of approach we need to start to develop for mental health issues. Get a diagnosis, get treatment and management, get healthy again, and get back to flying. And I think that's really at the heart of the recommendations from the ARC committee. It's all about restoring people to health and a recognition that these problems are prevalent, they are manageable, they are treatable, and we should regard them like any other medical condition.
Well, hopefully we've inspired a few people to take some steps to take action if they're dealing with issues here. Victor, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Max, and thanks for allowing us to talk about these rather sensitive issues.
And my thanks to Dr. Victor Vogel for joining us again here today. I've included links in the show notes to the Susquehanna STEM to the Skies project that he works with and to the National Association of Flight Instructors. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You